Christ. I am here to heal from complex PTSD, which is multiple repeated traumas over an extended period of time. My symptoms have presented themselves as substance abuse, shame, codependence, self-abandonment, anxiety, depression, anger, low self-worth, suicidal thoughts and actions, and more.
Hi, April.
I was one of those kids you'd look at and think didn't stand a chance, and as you're about to hear, statistically, I shouldn't be standing here. I grew up poor with a physically, mentally, and emotionally abusive mother addicted to alcohol, cocaine, and painkillers. My father worked during the day, often overtime, leaving me with my mother, her youth, and her string of affairs. When she wasn't occupied by a man, our days consisted of me watching her drink with her friends or getting abused if I wasn't hiding in my room. I would go days without my hair brushed or being showered, and I was often teased by the other kids for my dirtiness and appearance. My mother's family wasn't any help, favoring my cousins with expensive gifts, and one aunt even making hurtful comments about my unattractiveness. Even though at that point we were going to a church on a somewhat regular basis, I was never aware of anyone's attempt to help me or even showing concern with my disheveled state. My relationship with God at this time was believing if he existed, he certainly must not care about me. My parents divorced when I was 10, the court granted my mother custody, and things only got worse. I was immediately moved in with my mother and her new boyfriend, whom I had never met, and my mother began working at an apartment complex that he managed. This left me either alone at home or wandering the complex unsupervised. After a few months, I made friends with an older girl I hung out with while my mother was either working or at one of the apartments partying. The girl told me that she was a model and introduced me to her manager and photographer, who said he wanted to photograph me. Feeling excited, someone actually thought I was pretty, I agreed and went over to his apartment. The man pressured me to remove my clothes to increase my chances of getting discovered. When I wouldn't, he attempted to do so for me, and I fled the apartment. I didn't get a call back and assumed it was because I was not attractive enough. It was the first time I remember thinking if I had let him take off my clothes, he would have liked me. Of course, looking back now, I realized what was really going on. My mother's relationship ended not long after, and I was moved again at the age of 12. This time, I was in a house with my mother, her friend, and 3 of her friend's sons. My mother was rarely home, and when she was either withdrawing and I was taking care of her, or she was abusing me. My house quickly became the party house because the adults weren't there. This is when I was introduced to alcohol and marijuana. Within a couple of months, the older boys who were 19 began hooking up with my 12-year-old friends, and I was helping them sell drugs. This went on for an entire year until after one night of partying, my mother came home high and angry, abusing me so badly I still have scars. That night she took off and I didn't hear from her for years. With my mother gone, I moved in with my father, who had become distant and depressed. Now that I was living with him, his depression also caused him to become emotionally and mentally abusive. He often told me no one liked me, everyone used me, and nothing was good enough no matter how hard I tried. At 14, I gave into temptation and started using harder drugs. I became so desperate for others' approval that I allowed people to severely mistreat and use me. I thought that if I didn't have something to offer people, they wouldn't like me. Sadly, this included my body. The first time I blacked out, I was only 15. I have no recollection of what happened that night, only that I woke up naked on the sofa of a man's house that I didn't know, and it was laughed off with me and my friends as if it was no big deal. Around the age of 16, my mother came back into my life and not only began using drugs in front of me, she also supplied me and my friends. My father lost his job when I was 17, leaving us temporarily homeless and living in a cheap hotel room. Not wanting to be around his anger and verbal abuse, I began staying at my boyfriend's house, but that relationship ended when he and his friend sexually assaulted and abused me for hours. I never reported it. Instead, I dove deeper into drinking and using drugs. It was around that time I made my first suicide attempt. A year later, my ex was arrested for sexually assaulting his 10-year-old sister. I blamed myself. Crippled with guilt, I fully immersed myself into drug culture. I dropped out of high school, began going to raves, touring with bands, and chasing a party lifestyle, hoping to find some sort of happiness. I abused over-the-counter and prescription medications when I couldn't get anything harder, sometimes mixing deadly cocktails of both and chasing it down with alcohol just to numb the pain. When I was 21, a close friend died of a heroin overdose. I spiraled even further into my use. Then after a miscarriage, another suicide attempt when I was 23, I got sober and remained so for 7 years. Still, I didn't face my traumas, change the way I was living, or who I spent my time with. I was what you would call a dry drunk. After another 4-year abusive relationship, a battle with an eating disorder, and my mother disappearing for what turned out to be another 5 years, at 30, I relapsed with alcohol. By the age of 32, I had lost over a dozen friends and family members to addiction-related causes. After losing 3 more friends to overdoses in 1 year, I began my search for God. This included reading different religious texts, and eventually I was led to the Bible. But my faith still wasn't there. I continued to use substances to numb the pain and place my worth in other people. Then, after another night of too much drinking, I was sexually taken advantage of. Living in denial about what happened, I allowed myself to fall into a codependent relationship with my abuser, who eventually threatened my life. I fell into such a deep depression I couldn't leave the house. I started having visions of floating under the moon and slowly sinking underwater. It felt peaceful and I knew it was from God, but I thought he was telling me to end my life. Not wanting to be alone with those thoughts, I started going out again, this time using cocaine to fix my depression, until one night I got a bag laced with fentanyl and I could have died. Scared about the risk, I stopped using drugs, and then about a year later, I made the decision to get fully sober again and began working at a detox facility. This was life-changing for me. I can't even explain how it feels to watch people in full withdrawal pleading with God. I questioned my own faith. How can people in worse positions than me have so much of it and I have so little? I started reading the Bible more. Then one night, after a stressful month and being burnt out emotionally, I broke down in my front yard after work. It was the first time I remember having a real conversation with God. I asked him what he wanted me to do, and the vision popped in my head. Again, I thought he was telling me to end my life, but when I stopped fighting the vision, I saw the ending. It hadn't been a vision of suicide, it was a vision of baptism. He was telling me to come home to him. The next day, I started calling churches with all of my questions and was connected with a pastor who took his time and answered every question openly and honestly. He then invited me to attend a Bible study and service. I instantly fell in love with worship and started studying the Word more, but I still questioned my faith in God's love for me. You see, having a family is my biggest dream, and at that point I had been told that I would likely not be able to have children due to a severe diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome, known as PCOS. Both of my ovaries were entirely covered in cysts. I didn't understand how I could be given the life I was born into and then also denied the life I desired. Then after about a year of sobriety, with a regular habit of church, studying the Word and praying, I went to the doctor and every scan came back normal. My doctor couldn't explain it, but I had been healed. Take delight in the Lord and he will give you your heart's desire. Psalm 37:4. I got baptized by that head pastor a few months later. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, being isolated for months brought on the worst cravings I had ever experienced, along with complete hopelessness. So I created a program for myself to stay busy, including a weekly online Celebrate Recovery meeting through a church in Brooklyn. The group leader said something to me on the first day that stuck with me. Recovery is not simply about staying sober. It's about making the commitment every day to be a healthier person. It's about facing all of your hurts, hang-ups, and bad habits. With support of my group and intensive trauma processing with my counselor, I was finally correctly diagnosed with complex PTSD and able to start identifying the triggers causing my substance and mental health relapse. I prayed for God to remove people in my life who were no longer serving me, many who never really did, and to keep adding people who would help me grow, and he did just that. People from my old life fell away as I learned to set proper boundaries, began to stick up for myself, and remain sober. And let me tell you, that was almost everyone I thought that I was close with. I lost my spot. There were nights when the loneliness was unbearable, but at the same time, I found myself at peace, knowing God was in control. Changing people, places, and things is not just a suggestion. It is advice from generations of people who have worked the programs before us and have been successful. Do not be misled. Bad company corrupts good character. 1 Corinthians 15:33. I am now surrounded by people who support me, whose love I do not question, and who respect my boundaries. I can be myself, warts and all. Offering gifts, help, and time is now entirely out of love, not out of fear of abandonment or desperation. I don't need constant communication and reassurance to feel connected. My codependency gets better every day, and I have healthy relationships for the first time in my life. and that prayer is still active today. God continues to provide me with reflection and peace when people fall away from my life. He continues to help me grow, and through my work here, I have learned that when someone cannot respect my boundaries, is uncomfortable hearing my thoughts and feelings, or not capable of providing me with the support I need, not the support they think I need, it's a reflection on them, not on my worth. I have learned that I am not too much. For a long time, the hardest step for me was forgiveness and not holding on to resentment. Truthfully, it's something I still struggle with sometimes. As a victim of abuse and assault, it's difficult to hear that I must forgive my abusers, even being told by some people that God wouldn't forgive me if I didn't. I still believe God has more grace than we can even begin to imagine, but before understanding what forgiving someone actually means, the very thought of it infuriated me. Society portrays forgiving someone as no longer holding what they did to you against them, but that's not the case. One night, as I was crying out to the Lord, he told me to give my unforgiveness to him. Cast all your worries on him, for he cares about you. 1 Peter 5:7. And I did. Father, please forgive them because I'm not strong enough to. Over time, the resentment and hate began to diminish, and as it did, I could feel myself getting closer to God. I started seeing my abusers as the broken humans that they are, and was even able to give some of them grace. God showed me that forgiveness is letting go of resentment, hate, or vengeance towards someone or something. It's understanding that God is in control, and it is him who they will need to answer to. I can forgive and still be angry. I can forgive and keep my distance and have healthy boundaries. I can forgive and still hold my abusers accountable. I can forgive and still know that the things that have happened to me are not okay. Forgiveness is not reestablishing a relationship, giving my abusers a free pass, or allowing the abuse to continue. It's trusting God will handle it. Something that blocked me for so long from the beauty Jesus gave us was hate. Hatred fueled my life, and it's been hard to love and forgive even myself with so much of it consuming me. I often have to remind myself God didn't want this for me. It was not his plan for me to be hurt and abused, but it was also not his plan for my abusers to be hurt or abused, as so many of them often are. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. Jeremiah 29:11. At the end of last summer, I joined a group of women to lead a step study. This time has been much different than my first. My first study was virtual during COVID, so there wasn't fellowship or interaction outside of sharing. My biggest hurdle was writing my inventory and being unprepared when flashbacks resurfaced. God gave me the strength and had perfectly placed the people I needed to get me through it. I stuck with it, and I genuinely believe I am stronger for it. In the recent group, relationships have formed, and there is fellowship before, after, and outside of meetings. Some dynamics have been challenging, especially as a leader. It's been a new learning experience with many trials for my codependency and inner child wounds, which has presented many opportunities for deep self-reflection, healing, and prayer. Step 4 says, let us examine our ways and test them, and let us return to the Lord, Lamentations 3:40. And this study is helping me do just that. I've learned that part of having faith in God means fully accepting where others are in their journey without trying to influence them, unless they ask. I've learned the importance of navigating my own boundaries so I can provide myself with safety without trying to control the people around me. And I've learned to accept that some people just aren't ready to see themselves, and it's not my responsibility to show them. A repeated question throughout the study: what areas of your life have you been able to turn over to your higher power, Jesus Christ? A couple of weeks ago, this question hit me differently. I answered, well, everything, but also nothing. I realized that even though I've surrendered my life to Jesus, I was still living in fear because I didn't trust him. Growing up being shamed and abused for expressing my feelings or being upset that my needs weren't being met had caused me to believe God would also not take care of me. I felt that praying for my own needs and desires and then feeling hurt and upset when I felt neglected or abandoned was me being manipulative. Because of this, I remained in abusive, toxic situations. The most recent was a toxic workplace long after God had told me to get out, upset he wasn't opening doors to do so, and that the path I perceived as safe wasn't laid out perfectly in front of me. I realized I was still trying to have the illusion of control, but I was only hurting myself because staying there wasn't what he wanted for me. So I took a leap of faith and resigned without a solid job offer. The first week, I was elated. I felt confident and loved and just so sure everything was going to work out. Then a week passed and there was still no offer or other prospects, and I started getting anxious. Then 2 weeks went by. I started losing hope and faith and fell into old habits of not trusting God. I forgot it's His timing, not mine. On Good Friday, I got an official verbal offer from my dream job and will be signing with them later this week. Taking that leap of faith allowed me to give notice and not have to jump right into working a new job. It gave me time to process and heal from the last few years, time that I wouldn't have had otherwise, time that God knew that I needed. Working the steps with my sponsor and attending Celebrate Recovery meetings has allowed me to make giant steps in my faith, to identify and work on my character defects, and to continue my journey to becoming a healed and healthy person. I no longer stay in relationships that are unhealthy for me. I no longer beg people to stay in my life. I have learned that other people's versions of me are not my responsibility to change, even if they are wildly inaccurate or painful. God has continued to give me the strength and courage to face my traumas head on and take the steps needed to heal my PTSD without substances. Yesterday, I celebrated 6 years sober from alcohol. I am 7 years clean from hard drugs, and in October I celebrated 17 years of not abusing medications or attempting to end my life. I graduated from Arizona State with a master's degree. I am a New York State certified recovery peer advocate and a Celebrate Recovery open share group leader. Through my recovery, I have been able to forgive and reconnect with my mother, who has also found the Lord and is celebrating her 10th year of recovery this summer. I no longer have thoughts of suicide, and though my life is still not perfect or far from where I desire it to be, I know I am still a work in progress. The difference is that with each generational or personal curse I overcome, there is more hope for my future, which is only possible by the grace of God. The deeper my connection is with Jesus, the more peace I find in the challenges and places I feel I lack, which is why it is essential for Him to be at the center of my recovery. To the newcomers, this path is hard, but you don't have to do it alone. I was in a dark place the first time I wrote this 3 years ago. I felt hopeless and disconnected from God, but I did something that I learned here. I reached out to church friends, to Celebrate Recovery friends. I reached out and told them I wasn't okay. And then I experienced something I never had before. Every person I reached out to responded. For the next month, my calendar was full. People were calling, texting, taking me out for meals, grocery shopping for me, spending more time with me, and some friends even helped pay bills. And I got through it. I'd love to tell you that since then my life has been sunshine and rainbows, but I would be lying. It's been a difficult few years. I've experienced some of my lowest lows and loneliest nights because the healing process in relationships are messy. But I keep reaching out and I keep coming back. And each time I get through it, I am closer to the person that God created me to be. So the message is this. I know many of us have past experiences causing us to feel as if we are burdens, that we always have to be okay, that we must put on a happy face to be liked, that we are too much or not enough. But we must remember that emotions are subjective. I'm not saying that what you feel isn't valid. I'm saying that just because you feel it's true doesn't mean that it is. And in the case of being a burden, God promises us we are not. The work is hard and uncomfortable, and there will be days that you feel weak, but you're not. On those days, on the days you want to quit, push through the lies because that's what they are. Reach out, come to one more meeting, tell someone you're not okay. Most importantly, don't give up, because if you let Him, God really will use this for good. Thank you for letting me.